Morning brought relief, but not the courage to relax. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed efficiently, gathering my things and checking the cabin one last time. As I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A crude arrangement of sticks in a circle near the fire pit, as if marking territory. The realization hit me that someone had been watching, studying the cabin, and possibly me for days. Fear and anger mixed inside me. I needed to leave quickly. The journey back was tense. Every sound made me jump. Branches snapping under my own feet, birds taking off suddenly from the trees, the distant hum of insects. I kept my hatchet accessible, flashlight in hand, moving as quickly as I could without tripping. About halfway down the dirt road, I heard voices, low, murmuring, almost too far to distinguish. I froze and ducked behind a tree. Two figures appeared, moving deliberately along the path, seemingly unaware of my presence. They were large, heavy-set men, carrying what looked like backpacks and tools. My mind raced. I realized they were the ones who had been at the cabin, possibly living illegally in the woods, maybe even dangerous. I waited until they passed, keeping low, my heart pounding in my ears. Eventually, I reached the main road. Relief flooded through me when I saw a passing car, its lights cutting through the early evening gloom. I waved frantically, and the driver slowed, letting me hop in. I explained nothing, just thanked them and gave directions to the nearest town. The road out of the forest felt endless, but every mile was a mile away from that cabin, away from the fear and the unknown presence in the woods. Once in the town, I stopped at a small hotel, the first real safe place I had been in days. I showered, changed, and finally allowed myself to relax. I called the local authorities and reported the cabin, explaining that someone had been living illegally and possibly watching it. They noted it and promised to send someone, though I doubted the men would be there by the time anyone arrived. That night, I slept deeply, for the first time in days. The fear had not completely left me, but it had been replaced with a sense of safety and relief. I realized how quickly solitude could turn into danger, how easily the imagination could make a peaceful retreat into a nightmare. In the following days, I went back to my normal life, but I never forgot the cabin, the footsteps outside my door, the feeling of being watched. I avoided remote cabins after that. I learned to respect the idea of wilderness, not as a peaceful escape, but as a place where I could be vulnerable, where unknown people or situations could be real threats. The experience was terrifying, but it taught me caution, preparation, and the importance of never underestimating the unknown. The ending of that trip was clear and decisive. I was safe, I survived, and I left the cabin permanently. I knew the forest still held its dangers, but I had escaped them. Months later, I returned to the town near the cabin to check. The authorities had investigated, and the cabin was now abandoned, the tracks gone. Whoever had been there had moved on or been caught. The experience remained with me, vivid in memory, a reminder that fear can be real, tangible, and overcome with careful observation, calm thinking, and decisive action. From that point on, I planned every trip carefully, researched every location thoroughly, and never ventured alone into remote areas without a solid plan and a reliable way to communicate. I understood the real dangers of isolation in the wilderness, the real fear that comes from human threats, and how quickly a place that seems safe can turn into a trap. I had sought peace in solitude, but what I found was vigilance, awareness, and survival. And in the end, that knowledge became my true reward, the kind that stays with you, shaping the way you approach the world, the wilderness, and life itself. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. The forest I chose was remote, far from any town or road that people used regularly. I liked the isolation. It gave me a sense of calm, a place where I could hear nothing but the wind in the trees and the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of a squirrel. I wanted to test myself, to be completely alone in the wilderness for a few days, away from everything. I knew the risks, but I felt prepared. I had maps, a compass, extra food, a first aid kit, and all the gear I could need. I had done smaller trips before, but this one was longer and deeper into uninhabited territory. I left early in the morning, carrying my backpack filled with camping gear. The trailhead was quiet, and the air was crisp with the smell of pine and earth. The path was narrow, winding between dense trees, with roots and rocks making every step cautious. My boots crunched on the fallen leaves, and I could hear a small stream running somewhere to my right. I had decided to follow this stream because I knew there would be water nearby, and it would be easier to orient myself if I had a natural landmark. As I walked, I made mental notes of landmarks. A large fallen oak with a trunk split down the middle, a small clearing where sunlight hit the moss in a perfect square, a rock shaped like a natural bench. I felt the excitement building, the quiet satisfaction of being alone, away from any distractions. Hours passed, and the forest seemed endless. The sun climbed higher, and I occasionally stopped to drink water and eat a granola bar. I knew the first day's goal was simply to find a good spot to set up camp before nightfall. Eventually, I found a small clearing near the stream. The ground was relatively flat, the trees surrounding it offering a buffer from the wind. I checked my surroundings carefully, noting the direction of the stream, the slope of the land, and the density of trees nearby. I set down my backpack and began setting up my tent. I chose a spot slightly raised, so in case of sudden rain, the water wouldn't pool around my sleeping area. I staked the tent carefully, making sure every line was taut. I organized my supplies, putting food in a bear-proof container and keeping my water filter and first aid kit easily accessible. As evening approached, the forest took on a different character. Shadows grew long, stretching across the ground, and the light became golden and then dim. I built a small fire, careful to keep it controlled and away from dry leaves and pine needles. The fire crackled and popped, and I roasted a simple meal over it. The smell of cooked beans and rice filled the air, mixing with the damp smell of the forest floor. I enjoyed the sound of the fire and the occasional splash of the stream, feeling a sense of contentment. Night came fast. Once the fire died down, I moved into my tent, zipped it closed, and lay on my sleeping pad. I had brought a headlamp and a small flashlight, but I wanted to see how dark the forest could get without artificial light. Soon, it became almost completely black outside, the moon partially hidden by clouds. I could hear the sounds of the forest at night, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional distant howl of some animal. I tried to convince myself it was probably a coyote or a fox, nothing more. I fell asleep with my knife next to me, the compass and whistle close by, feeling secure in my preparations. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound that made my heart pound. It wasn't the usual rustle of leaves or distant animal call. This was something different, something heavier, slower, deliberate. I froze, listening. The sound came from near the stream. My mind raced. Could it be a deer? But it sounded too heavy, too purposeful. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The forest looked calm, moonlight glinting off the stream. Nothing seemed out of place. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a raccoon or a bear foraging near the water. I had stored all my food properly, but wild animals were curious, and bears especially could be persistent. I turned on my flashlight and swept it across the trees, trying to see any movement. For a few seconds, nothing. Then I saw it. A figure moving through the trees, not quite an animal, too tall, too upright. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my knife and quietly unzipped the tent fully, peeking out. The figure was about 20 meters away, partially hidden behind a tree, but I could see it moving slowly, almost like it was following the stream. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to stay calm, to avoid drawing attention. I turned off my flashlight and ducked back into the tent. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help. I thought about my options. I could stay put, try to wait it out, or I could pack up quietly and move. Staying meant I risked confrontation. Moving meant navigating in darkness through unfamiliar terrain. My rational side knew that moving quietly without making noise was my best option. I waited a few minutes, listening. The sound of movement had stopped. I carefully unzipped the tent slightly and peered out. The figure was gone. My heart was racing, and I realized how alone I really was. I packed the essentials into my backpack: knife, flashlight, compass, water, and the small bag of food. I left the tent behind. I decided to follow the stream, hoping it would lead me downstream to a trail or road. The night was colder than I expected. The stream's water reflected the moonlight, and I kept close to it, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. Every sound made me jump. A branch breaking under my own weight, the rush of water over a small ledge, the call of a distant animal. I tried to keep moving silently, focusing on staying alert. After what felt like hours, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I stopped and listened, they stopped too. I couldn't see anything. I realized someone or something was following me. I kept my head down, trying to appear small and inconspicuous. Eventually, the terrain changed. The forest thinned slightly, and I began to see signs of human presence. Old tire tracks partially overgrown, a rusted signpost leaning to one side. Relief washed over me. I was near a forest road. I increased my pace, making sure to stay close to the cover of trees while moving towards what I hoped was safety. After another half hour, I finally saw a small cabin near the edge of the road. It was abandoned, with boarded windows and a sagging porch, but it was solid and provided shelter. I approached cautiously, checking all sides, then went inside. The cabin was dusty and filled with spider webs, but it was dry. I barricaded the door with a fallen beam and sat down, exhausted. As dawn approached, I finally allowed myself to relax. The events of the night played over in my mind. The figure near the stream, the footsteps following me, the sheer terror of being so isolated. But I also realized I had survived, relying on my preparation and calm thinking. The morning brought sunlight filtering through cracks in the cabin walls, and I could see the forest in a less threatening light. I found an old map left in the cabin by previous visitors and traced a route back to the nearest ranger station. By late morning, I cautiously made my way out of the forest, following the rough trail that the map indicated. The sunlight and familiar terrain helped reduce my anxiety, and eventually, I reached the ranger station. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and shaken, but I was safe. The rangers listened to my story, offered water, and let me use their radio to call a friend for pickup. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief when I saw my friend's car approaching. The experience left a mark on me. I had prepared thoroughly, and that preparation saved me, but I realized the forest held dangers beyond animals and weather. The presence of another human in that remote area, unseen, unknown, was the scariest part. I had faced that fear, stayed calm, and survived. I returned home, grateful for my safety, but with a new respect for the isolation of the wilderness. I knew I could never underestimate it again. I waited a few minutes, listening. The sound of movement had stopped. I carefully unzipped the tent slightly and peered out. The figure was gone. My heart was racing, and I realized how alone I really was. I packed the essentials into my backpack: knife, flashlight, compass, water, and the small bag of food. I left the tent behind. I decided to follow the stream, hoping it would lead me downstream to a trail or road. The night was colder than I expected. The stream's water reflected the moonlight, and I kept close to it, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. Every sound made me jump. A branch breaking under my own weight, the rush of water over a small ledge, the call of a distant animal. I tried to keep moving silently, focusing on staying alert. After what felt like hours, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I stopped and listened, they stopped too. I couldn't see anything. I realized someone or something was following me. I kept my head down, trying to appear small and inconspicuous. Eventually, the terrain changed. The forest thinned slightly, and I began to see signs of human presence. Old tire tracks partially overgrown, a rusted signpost leaning to one side. Relief washed over me. I was near a forest road. I increased my pace, making sure to stay close to the cover of trees while moving towards what I hoped was safety. After another half hour, I finally saw a small cabin near the edge of the road. It was abandoned, with boarded windows and a sagging porch, but it was solid and provided shelter. I approached cautiously, checking all sides, then went inside. The cabin was dusty and filled with spider webs, but it was dry. I barricaded the door with a fallen beam and sat down, exhausted. As dawn approached, I finally allowed myself to relax. The events of the night played over in my mind. The figure near the stream, the footsteps following me, the sheer terror of being so isolated. But I also realized I had survived, relying on my preparation and calm thinking. The morning brought sunlight filtering through cracks in the cabin walls, and I could see the forest in a less threatening light. I found an old map left in the cabin by previous visitors and traced a route back to the nearest ranger station. By late morning, I cautiously made my way out of the forest, following the rough trail that the map indicated. The sunlight and familiar terrain helped reduce my anxiety, and eventually, I reached the ranger station. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and shaken, but I was safe. The rangers listened to my story, offered water, and let me use their radio to call a friend for pickup. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief when I saw my friend's car approaching. The experience left a mark on me. I had prepared thoroughly, and that preparation saved me, but I realized the forest held dangers beyond animals and weather. The presence of another human in that remote area, unseen, unknown, was the scariest part. I had faced that fear, stayed calm, and survived. I returned home, grateful for my safety, but with a new respect for the isolation of the wilderness. I knew I could never underestimate it again. I had been working too much and had not taken a real break in months, maybe even more than a year. Every day had started to feel the same, and I noticed myself staring at walls for long periods of time at home without realizing it. I wanted a way out of the noise, the phones, the screens, and the same patterns that had turned my life into something dull. I decided that the only thing that could help me reset my head was going back into nature alone for a few days. I used to camp alone a lot when I was younger, and those hours in silence used to give me peace I could not find anywhere else. So I picked a weekend, packed my bag, and headed out for a camping trip far away from everything. I chose a national forest several hours from home. I had been there once before, years ago, and I remembered how large and open the land felt. No crowds, no trails filled with loud hikers, and no campsites stacked on top of each other. Just space, trees, rivers, and the feeling of being very small in a world much bigger than I usually remembered. The further I drove, the fewer houses and buildings I saw. Highways turned into smaller roads loosened into cracked country lanes, and eventually the pavement disappeared completely and I was on dirt. My truck shook over stones and loose dust as tall trees rose high on both sides like walls. I felt something inside me calm down as the phone signal disappeared for good. I parked in an open area where the Forest Service allowed backcountry access. There were no other vehicles in sight, and I saw no signs of recent camping activity. I loaded my pack onto my shoulders, took a deep breath of the silent morning air, and started hiking deeper into the forest. My plan was simple. Hike for several hours, find a spot near a river, set up camp, relax, and be completely alone for a few days with nothing but thoughts and nature. The hike was quiet except for the constant sound of the forest, birds, wind, and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere deeper in the trees. The air was cool, and the sunlight filtered through the branches above me in thin, moving beams. The trail slowly vanished until I was walking on uneven forest floor, stepping over fallen logs, rocks, and layers of old pine needles. My map told me the river should be about 6 kilometers in, and after 2.5 hours of steady hiking, I finally heard the sound of rushing water ahead. The river was wide, not huge, but strong enough for white foam to appear where it pushed over rocks. The water was cold and clear, and the banks were covered in thick ferns and moss. I walked upstream a little, looking for a flat space where I could set up my tent without being too close to the water. Camping too close to rivers was never smart, especially in places where water levels could change suddenly. I found a small clearing surrounded by tall trees with open sky above, just enough sunlight reaching the ground to dry it out and make it feel open instead of dark and enclosed. I dropped my backpack, stretched my shoulders, and immediately got to work setting up camp. I laid out the tent, drove the stakes deep into the ground, inflated my sleeping pad, and organized everything the way I always did. Fire pit away from the tent, food hung later to keep animals away, and tools stored where I could reach them quickly in the dark. I made a small fire, boiled water, ate simple food, and finally sat down on a flat rock facing the flowing river. That first hour of sitting in silence reminded me exactly why I had come. No cars, no music, no voices, no notifications buzzing in my pocket. Just air, water, and space to think. I stayed like that for a long time, maybe an hour, maybe two. Time felt different out there. When I finally stood up, the sun was already lower than I expected. A light chill settled into the air. I felt tired but calm, both my body and brain slowing down in a way that felt right. I gathered enough firewood for the night, prepared everything I would need once it got dark, and enjoyed the last light of the day while the fire cracked and shadows moved slowly along the ground. Night settled fast. One moment there was soft orange glow in the sky, and the next moment everything beyond the fire ring was a dark wall of trees. The river sound felt louder now that the world was silent. I sat with my small fire and stared into the flames, thinking about life, thinking about how good it felt to be somewhere nobody expected anything from me. After a while, when the fire turned to glowing coals, I extinguished it properly, zipped the tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. I fell asleep fast. I woke up sometime during the night, and at first I did not know why. The forest was silent except for the water and the distant sound of branches shifting in the wind. My heart was beating fast, like my body had reacted to something even if my brain did not fully register it. I lay still, trying to listen. The inside of my tent was completely dark. I could hear nothing unusual. After several minutes of trying to calm myself, I began to assume it was just a strange dream or my body reacting to being in a new environment again after so long away from real camping. I rolled over, tightened my sleeping bag around my shoulders, and eventually fell back asleep. The second time I woke up, I knew exactly why. Something was moving outside. It was not the sound of the wind. It was not branches bending on their own. It was footsteps. Slow, heavy, careful footsteps. The kind that belonged to something large. My heartbeat sped up like it was trying to punch through my ribs. My mouth went dry. I forced myself to breathe slowly through my nose so the sound of it would not make me panic even more. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring into the darkness, completely motionless. The forest, which had felt peaceful earlier, now felt too big, too quiet, like something unseen was watching me. I had no idea where the footsteps had stopped or if whatever it was still there. I waited at least a full minute, maybe more, before building up enough courage to slowly sit up and reach for my flashlight. Before I clicked it on, I listened again. The forest was completely silent. When the light came on, I saw only the yellow fabric of my tent. No movement, no shadows, no shapes. I pointed the beam toward the tent wall where the sound had seemed closest, but I could see nothing beyond the thin barrier. I wanted to unzip the door and look outside, but every instinct in my body told me not to. Instead, I sat in silence, flashlight still in my hand, heart pounding against my chest while I tried to think logically. In a forest like this, the most realistic explanation was a large animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear, maybe a moose. The steps had been slow and heavy, so it was most likely not a deer. A bear made the most sense, especially near a flowing river. If it was a bear, I knew better than to make noise or startle it. The best thing was to stay quiet and still, let it lose interest and wander off. So I did exactly that. I turned the flashlight off again and sat motionless in the dark, listening. I waited a long time. The silence felt endless. Eventually, my breathing slowed, and after several more minutes of hearing nothing at all, I lay down again. I stayed awake for a while just in case, but exhaustion eventually overpowered everything. When I woke in the morning, sunlight was coming through the tent walls. I unzipped the door and stepped outside into fresh, cold air. Everything looked normal. The campsite was untouched. But when I examined the area around the tent, I saw something that made my chest tighten. There were tracks, large ones, fresh ones. They circled the tent and led back into the trees. I knelt down and studied the prints. They were bear tracks, not cub-sized, adult-sized. The heavy footsteps I heard during the night had been exactly what I thought. I felt a mix of fear and relief. Fear because I realized how close it had been. Relief because it was gone and nothing had happened. I checked my food bag hanging from a sturdy branch, and it was untouched. That meant the bear had either not smelled it or was not hungry enough to try. Either way, I felt extremely lucky. I could have packed up right there and left. Many people would have, but I had come for peace, and I refused to let a single animal sighting chase me out. Bears existed in forests. That was their home. I knew how to behave in bear country, and I had done things correctly. So I decided to stay another night. I told myself I would be more careful, hang food even higher, and stay extra alert. I spent the day fishing, collecting firewood, eating and hiking upstream. The weather was perfect. The forest was beautiful. The river washed away the remaining stress from life back home. By late afternoon, I felt fully relaxed again, even after the nighttime scare. As evening approached, I prepared everything earlier than the day before. I built a solid fire with large rocks protecting it from wind, boiled more water, ate a bigger meal, and then cleaned every piece of cooking gear thoroughly so no smell would linger. I hung the food bag even higher this time, tied it off well, and double-checked everything around camp. When darkness came, I sat by the fire for a long time, listening to the river and the soft pops of burning wood. My nerves had settled again, and I felt ready for another good night of rest. When I eventually put out the fire and got inside the tent, I lay down and tried to fall asleep. It took longer this time. The memory of the footsteps lingered, but eventually exhaustion dulls fear and I drifted off. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke again. And this time, I immediately knew something was different. There were footsteps again, but they were not heavy this time. They were soft, controlled, light, slow. Not the cautious walking of a large animal. These steps sounded like something trying not to be heard at all. I froze instantly, eyes open in the darkness, breathing stopped. I listened as the soft steps circled the tent once, then again, then again. Something was walking around me, but this time it was not moving the way a bear or large animal would. It was deliberate, careful, too quiet, too slow. Almost like a person walking on the balls of their feet to move silently. My skin turned cold beneath my clothes. My pulse hammered in my ears. No one knew I was here. I had seen no hikers, no campers, no vehicles. I was deep in the forest, miles away from any maintained sites. Nobody should be out here, especially not walking quietly around a tent in the middle of the night. I stayed perfectly silent and tried to listen past the sound of my own heart beating. The steps stopped. I could no longer hear movement, but I could feel something, presence, like something was standing only a few feet away, listening, waiting, trying to decide something. While I lay there frozen, I began to realize something that made the situation far worse. There were no bear sounds. Animals make noise. They rustle. They grunt. They breathe loudly. But the silence outside was human in nature. It was the silence of someone holding their breath, someone trying not to make sound, someone trying to be invisible in the darkness. I stared at the tent wall, seeing nothing but the faint outline of nylon lit only by weak moonlight. Every survival instinct I had was screaming inside. I slowly reached for my flashlight and then for the fixed blade knife I always kept in a side pocket near my sleeping pad. My hand shook so hard I thought the sound of my skin brushing the sleeping bag would give me away. The steps did not return for a long time. I lay motionless, afraid that even shifting my weight would make noise. The silence stretched out until my chest ached from tension. I stayed like that maybe 10 minutes, maybe 20. Time became hard to measure. Then finally, I heard the faintest sound, leaves crushing lightly under weight, moving away from the tent, slowly, carefully, fading into the deeper forest. I exhaled slowly through my nose and stayed still. I did not go outside. I did not turn on my light. I waited until the first hint of dawn light began to change the shape of the tent walls. Only then did I unzip the door. The forest looked normal. Too normal. No immediate tracks stood out. though the hard-packed ground around the tent made prints faint. I scanned every inch of the ground until I saw something faint in the soft dirt a few feet away, an imprint that looked more like a boot sole than an animal track. That was when I realized something terrifying. The night before might have really been a bear, but this time, it had been a person. Someone had walked quietly around my tent, alone, in the middle of the night, deep in the woods where nobody should be. And they had done it silently, carefully, almost like they had been studying the tent from the outside. I felt a rising pressure in my chest that made my vision narrow. I began packing immediately. I broke down the tent fast but quietly, every movement stiff with fear. I did not eat breakfast. I did not rest. I loaded everything onto my back, extinguished the fire pit, and started hiking out as soon as the pack was strapped shut. My plan was simple: move fast, stay alert, and get back to the truck before anything else happened. I had always loved camping alone. The quiet, the smell of the forest, the rhythm of nature. It felt like a break from everything. That weekend, I decided to go deeper than usual, far past the usual hiking trails into a remote part of the national forest I had been studying for weeks. I wanted isolation, to push myself, and to enjoy the raw, untouched wilderness. I packed carefully: a small tent, sleeping bag, water filter, a first aid kit, extra food, a stove, and a compact but sharp knife. I also carried a map and a compass just in case I lost cell signal, which I knew I probably would. The drive to the trailhead was long. By the time I parked, the sun was just beginning to lower behind the trees, painting the sky in dull oranges and purples. I double-checked my backpack, tightened the straps, and started on the trail. The air was crisp, the smell of pine strong, and the sound of distant birds and a nearby creek soothing. I felt alive, free, and calm. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail twisted and turned, sometimes rocky, sometimes muddy from recent rain. The forest was dense, sunlight filtering through the canopy, leaving shifting patterns on the ground. I passed old fallen trees and thick underbrush, noting the signs of animals, tracks, chewed branches, and a few fresh droppings. I felt a twinge of respect and caution, knowing I wasn't entirely alone. I moved quietly, aware of every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. By late afternoon, I decided to set up camp near a small clearing beside a slow-moving stream. The ground was uneven but soft with pine needles, and a few large rocks would provide good windbreaks. I set up my tent, collected firewood, and started a small fire. The warmth and crackling sound was comforting. I prepared my simple meal, enjoying the quiet solitude. As the sun sank below the treetops, shadows lengthened, and the forest seemed to shift around me. The rustling in the leaves became more pronounced. I told myself it was just the wind, small animals moving, nothing more. Night fell quickly. The fire's glow provided a small circle of light, the rest of the forest disappearing into darkness. I secured my food in a bear-proof container and placed it a short distance from the tent, just in case. I checked my knife and flashlight, feeling a small surge of unease. Alone, in the middle of the forest, every noise seemed amplified. My heartbeat picked up slightly with every sudden rustle or crack. I told myself it was all normal. A deer, a raccoon, or perhaps a tree branch giving way. Around midnight, the noises changed. They weren't random rustling anymore. There were soft, deliberate cracks, slow footsteps approaching the clearing from the north side. First, I froze, listening. My mind raced through possibilities, maybe another hiker, maybe an animal. But the sound didn't match a deer or bear. It was heavier, more deliberate. I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself that I had seen signs of people hiking in the area, though rarely. The steps stopped near the edge of the clearing. I could hear the faintest brush against leaves, like someone moving carefully, trying not to make too much noise. My instincts screamed at me to grab my knife and stay quiet. I tried to make myself small, huddled slightly in the shadows of my tent, and hoped whoever or whatever it was would move on. Minutes felt like hours. Then the sound of snapping branches came again, closer, circling my camp. I realized I wasn't being approached by a random hiker. Something or someone was testing the area, moving deliberately, observing. Fear washed over me, sharp and visceral. I wasn't scared of ghosts or myths or wild creatures. I was scared of another human. The forest had its dangers, and this was different, calculated, intelligent, and very real. I stayed frozen, listening. The footsteps paused, then moved again, closer to my fire. I noticed that shadows moved just beyond the circle of light. The hairs on my neck stood up. I slowly unzipped my backpack, careful not to make a sound, and retrieved my flashlight. I kept it in my lap, pointed toward the ground, ready to shine if needed. The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows. I held my breath, heart pounding. The intruder didn't make any noise for what felt like forever. I couldn't see him yet, only hear the subtle shifts in the underbrush. The smell hit me then, a mix of dirt, sweat, and metal. Something about it made my stomach twist. This was no ordinary hiker, no lost camper. My mind raced through escape plans. I couldn't outrun someone if they caught me by surprise. My knife was small. It was better for emergencies than defense against a strong, determined human. Then came the snap of a larger branch. My firelight caught a figure moving at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my small circle of warmth. He was tall, bulky, wearing dark clothing that blended perfectly into the night. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. I realized then that he had probably been watching me for some time, maybe hours, maybe since I arrived. The thought made my stomach drop. I knew I had to act, but slowly, carefully. Any sudden movement and he might attack. I quietly reached into my backpack and pulled out a small flare. It was a last resort item, but if I fired it, it would make light and noise, scaring him off or at least giving me a chance to run. My hands shook, and sweat ran down my face, cold and clammy. I didn't want to use it yet, not if I had another option. I remembered the stream nearby. Water could mask my scent and give me cover. I grabbed my pack quietly, then slowly stood, keeping low. I started moving toward the stream, one careful step at a time. My heart hammered in my chest. Every rustle of leaves, every broken twig, felt like it would give me away. The figure didn't move, just watched, patient and silent. I kept my breathing steady, trying not to make any sound. When I reached the stream, I crouched and splashed lightly in the shallow water. The sound of moving water covered small noises I made. I followed the stream for several minutes, keeping low and silent. The figure didn't pursue immediately, which gave me hope, but I knew it might. I needed a way out of the area, a road or trail. I followed the map in my mind, keeping the stream on my left as I moved north. Hours passed like this, crouching, moving slowly, stopping at every suspicious noise. Dawn began to break, faint light creeping through the trees. I finally found a faint trail, muddy and overgrown, probably used by forest rangers or hunters. Relief washed over me. I followed it cautiously, keeping my pack and knife ready, hoping it led to the main trail or road. Eventually, I saw a clearing ahead, and then the unmistakable sight of the old logging road I had driven in on. Exhausted, trembling, I sprinted the last few hundred meters. My legs burned. My lungs felt like they would collapse, but adrenaline carried me forward. Once I reached my car, I quickly got inside, locked the doors, and sat there gasping for air. I didn't look back into the forest. I didn't want to know if he was still there. I drove to the nearest ranger station as soon as possible. I reported everything in detail. My campsite, the footsteps, the figure, and how I escaped. Rangers thanked me and said they would check the area immediately. They warned me that sometimes people use the forest for illegal hunting, robberies, or worse. My encounter, while terrifying, wasn't unique in the world of backcountry camping. After that weekend, I never camped alone that deep into the forest again. I learned to respect nature, not just for its wildlife, but for the human dangers that sometimes hide behind the trees. I also invested in more safety equipment, GPS trackers, a whistle, bear spray, and always let someone know exactly where I would be. I never saw him again, and hopefully he never followed anyone else, but the fear and awareness stayed with me. a permanent reminder of how real danger can be and how careful one must always be, even in the wilderness. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, from the constant pressure of work and everything else. I picked a trail I had never been to before, somewhere deep in the woods where the forest felt untouched. The maps showed a small clearing near a river, perfect for setting up a tent and spending a couple of nights. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, a first aid kit, a sturdy knife, extra layers of clothing, and my flashlight with extra batteries. I had learned from previous trips never to underestimate the woods, no matter how experienced I thought I was. I left early in the morning before sunrise to get a head start and make it to the site before dark. The drive alone felt freeing. The city slowly disappeared behind me, replaced by stretches of open fields and patches of dense trees. By the time I arrived at the trailhead, the sun was fully up, casting long shadows through the trees. The air smelled fresh and earthy, damp in some places where early morning dew still clung to the leaves. I parked my car, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and stepped onto the trail. The first few hours were easy. The trail was well marked, and the terrain was gentle. Birds called to each other, and occasionally, I caught glimpses of deer or squirrels darting across the path. I kept a steady pace, stopping occasionally to drink water or check my map. Around midday, I reached a part of the trail where the terrain became rougher, with rocks and fallen logs scattered across the path. I could hear the river before I saw it, the faint sound of water rushing over stones. It was a comforting sound, promising a good spot to rest and set up camp. When I reached the clearing near the river, I dropped my backpack and took a long breath. The place was perfect, flat ground, close to the water, surrounded by tall pines that offered shade and some protection from the wind. I unpacked my tent and started setting it up, making sure it was secure. The soil was firm but slightly damp, so I hammered the stakes in carefully. Once the tent was up, I organized my gear inside, laying out my sleeping bag, food, and other supplies. I took a moment to just sit and look around. The river glittered in the afternoon sun, and the sound of rushing water was calming. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I spent the afternoon exploring the area around the clearing. I walked along the riverbank, stepping carefully over slippery rocks. I found a small path leading deeper into the woods, but it was overgrown and seemed unused. Still, I wandered a little, taking in the sights and sounds. The forest was alive. Birds flitted between branches, insects buzzed around, and the wind whispered through the pines. I collected some dry wood for a fire, choosing pieces that were straight and dry enough to burn well. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sun was starting to dip, and shadows stretched long across the clearing. I started the fire carefully, took some effort to get it going, but soon I had a small, steady flame. The warmth and light of the fire made me feel safe, even as the forest darkened around me. I cooked a simple meal over it, something that didn't take too long but gave me enough energy. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the natural beauty around me. The river's sound filled the silence, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. As night fell, the forest transformed. The shadows deepened, and the sounds changed. The birds were quiet now, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. I checked my flashlight and set up my camp for the night. The fire crackled, and I sat close enough to feel its warmth. The night felt vast, and for a moment, I felt completely alone, but in a way that was liberating. I was alone with nature, with no distractions, no people, no city noise. Then I heard it. At first, I wasn't sure. A snap, like a branch breaking, somewhere a little deeper in the woods. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I tried to focus on the fire, on the comforting sounds of the river. But the noise came again, closer this time. A deliberate snap, as if someone or something was stepping over branches. My stomach tightened. I had hiked alone many times, and I knew that sometimes small animals could sound frightening. But this was different. It had weight. It wasn't light-footed like a deer. It was heavy, deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and swept it across the treeline. Nothing, just shadows of trees swaying in the wind. My pulse was racing, and I felt my body tense. I told myself to stay calm. I was in a safe clearing, my fire provided light, and I had my knife. I checked my tent, making sure everything was secure. The snapping noises continued intermittently, sometimes near, sometimes further away, but always there. My sense of security began to fray. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time felt distorted. Every rustle of leaves, every animal call, made me jump. I tried to stay near the fire, keeping it burning bright. I couldn't see anyone or anything, but the feeling of being watched was constant. I debated whether to leave the fire and investigate, but something in me said it was too dangerous. Whoever or whatever was out there had been circling, waiting. I stayed put. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, slow. They were approaching, coming closer to my clearing. My flashlight shook in my hand as I turned it toward the edge of the trees. A figure emerged, not fully visible, just a shadow moving between the trunks. My heart pounded. I tried to remember everything I had read about survival situations. Make noise, make yourself appear threatening, stay visible. I shouted, but it wasn't loud enough to really intimidate anyone. The figure paused, then moved again. My mind raced. I had no idea if it was someone lost, someone dangerous, or even someone watching me for a long time. My fire was my only advantage. I couldn't run into the darkness of the forest unarmed. I picked up a heavy branch near the fire, holding it like a club, ready to defend myself. The figure moved closer, and I saw enough to know it was a person, not an animal. I shouted again, more firmly, trying to assert myself. The figure stopped. I kept my eyes fixed, my muscles tense, ready for any sudden movement. Time seemed to stretch. Then, almost suddenly, the figure turned and disappeared back into the darkness. I stayed by the fire for hours after, keeping it burning, my eyes straining to see anything moving. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I slept lightly, keeping my knife and branch close, my backpack under my head. Morning came slowly. The forest was quiet now, the oppressive tension from the night fading but still lingering. I packed up my campsite quickly, my nerves still raw. I kept my eyes on the path, scanning the trees as I walked back to the trailhead. Every snap of a branch, every rustle made me jump. I never looked back. I reached my car by late morning, drenched in sweat and adrenaline. The police later told me that there had been reports of people living illegally in the forests, sometimes watching hikers and campers for days. Some were dangerous, desperate, and unpredictable. I didn't see them clearly enough to know, but the memory of those heavy footsteps, the deliberate approach, stayed with me. I realized how quickly a peaceful trip could turn into something terrifying and how small choices, where to camp, whether to stay alert, could mean the difference between safety and danger. After that experience, I never went camping in isolated forests alone again. I learned to respect not just the wilderness, but the possibility of human threats hiding behind its beauty. I still love the outdoors, but I always plan, always stay alert, and I never underestimate the danger that comes from the unexpected. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from everything, from the city noise, the constant emails, the pressure, and just breathe. I had chosen a remote section of forest I had read about online, somewhere far from the nearest town. The map showed a small clearing near a river, and I thought it would be perfect for a quiet weekend alone. I packed carefully. A tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, a small first aid kit, water bottles, and my backpack weighed heavily, but I liked the feeling of being prepared. I had done camping before, but never this far into the wilderness. The drive had taken hours, winding through narrow roads, dense trees pressing on both sides, the sunlight barely reaching the asphalt. By the time I parked near the trailhead, it was early afternoon. I double-checked my backpack, tightened my hiking boots, and started down the narrow path. The forest was quiet in a way that felt almost alive. Birds occasionally called out, and the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth echoed, but there were no other humans. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, until all I could hear was my own breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The trail was harder than I expected. Roots and rocks jutted out in uneven patterns, and the incline was steeper than it looked on the map. I paused often to catch my breath, drinking water and wiping sweat from my forehead. The air was cooler under the thick canopy, damp in some spots, with the smell of wet earth and moss. I had studied the area carefully. I knew where streams crossed, where rocks formed natural bridges over small ravines, and where the trail forked. I kept mental notes, but despite all that preparation, a small unease grew inside me as I went further. The forest felt too quiet, too empty. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing I had aimed for. It was smaller than I imagined, framed by tall pines and dense undergrowth. A river ran along one side, narrow but fast, with water clear enough to see rocks on the bottom. The sound of the current was soothing. I started to set up my tent near a flat patch of ground a few meters from the water. I cleared leaves, moved small branches, and laid out my sleeping pad and bag. Everything felt peaceful as I worked, until I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Along the edge of the clearing, there were faint footprints in the soft dirt, too large to be a deer or a small animal. They weren't fresh, but they were recent enough to make me pay attention. I looked around, scanning the dense forest, but saw nothing. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone else had passed through days ago. Still, a small flicker of fear settled in. I reminded myself I wasn't deep in bear territory, and I had my knife and everything should be fine. I set up my small campfire, stacked some wood, and started a small flame. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, shadows stretched long across the clearing. The firelight made the forest edges look darker, more tangled. I cooked a simple meal of rice and canned beans, eating slowly, listening to the river and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the distance. By the time the food was gone, night had fully fallen. The moon was thin, barely enough to illuminate anything beyond the clearing. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to sleep. Sleep came fitfully. Every sound, the rustle of branches, a distant bird call, the flowing river, seemed amplified in the dark. At one point, I woke to the feeling that someone was outside, watching. I stayed still, straining my ears, but heard nothing but the usual forest noises. My imagination tried to fill in the gaps, and I told myself repeatedly that I was alone. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back to sleep. I woke the next morning before sunrise. Mist hovered over the river, and the forest smelled damp and fresh. I packed some things, planning to hike further along the trail before breakfast. As I stepped outside, I froze. The footprints from yesterday were closer to my tent now. Someone, or something, had walked near my camp overnight. My stomach sank. I checked my belongings. Everything was in place, but the presence of those prints made it impossible to ignore the idea that I was not as alone as I had thought. I decided to stay calm. I grabbed my knife, tied it to my belt, and moved cautiously toward the trail. I tried to listen, to watch for any movement, but the forest remained still. After a while, I thought maybe it was an animal or perhaps someone hiking through earlier, but the prints were too large for a deer, and no other signs suggested animal activity. I kept moving, sticking to the path, eyes scanning constantly. By late morning, I reached a narrow canyon where the river deepened. The area was beautiful but dangerous, with steep rocks and slippery moss. I paused to drink water and rest on a flat boulder. That's when I saw it. A figure in the distance, moving slowly along the trail. My heart jumped. It was human-shaped, wearing dark clothes but too far to see clearly. I ducked behind a tree and watched. The figure stopped, glanced in my direction, or so it seemed, and then continued walking away from me. Panic rose inside me, but I reminded myself to stay calm. I couldn't confront whoever it was, and I couldn't show fear. I waited a long time until I was sure the person had moved far away. Then I retraced my steps back toward my camp, moving faster this time, trying to make as much noise as possible so there would be no surprise encounters. My camp looked the same as when I left, but the unease had grown. I packed everything quickly, deciding not to stay another night. As I moved along the trail with my backpack, my mind kept racing. The forest no longer felt peaceful. Every shadow, every crack of a branch, made me tense. By late afternoon, I had reached a small ridge with a view of the valley below. I paused, thinking about taking a break, when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints again, recent, heading toward me along the narrow ridge. Whoever had been following or whoever else had come was now very close. I tried to move quietly, keeping to the side of the trail, but one misstep sent a rock tumbling down the slope. The sound echoed loudly. I froze, holding my breath. The prints stopped, and then I heard a rustling behind me. Someone was very near. I gripped my knife tightly and considered my options. I could run downhill toward the road I had seen on the map, or I could try to climb to higher ground and hide. I chose to run. Adrenaline surged as I sprinted downhill, jumping over rocks, dodging branches, my legs burning. The forest became a blur. I didn't look back. I couldn't risk seeing them. I focused only on moving fast, following the small stream I had passed the first day, hoping it would lead me toward the road. My lungs burned. My arms scraped against branches, but I didn't stop. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin. I could see the open road far below. Relief surged, but I still moved cautiously, scanning for any sign of the person. Finally, I reached the edge of the forest and emerged onto the gravel road. I ran along it, waving my arms, hoping someone would see me. Eventually, a car appeared in the distance. I flagged it down. The driver stopped, and I collapsed near the roadside, gasping, covered in mud and scratches. They called the police, and I explained as best I could. They drove me back to safety. Later, I returned with authorities to check the area. Tracks were found, but no one was ever located. The forest was remote enough that someone could easily vanish without a trace. I never camped alone again. The experience stayed with me, not because of a ghost, not because of monsters, but because of the real human danger I had narrowly escaped. The isolation, the quiet, and the way the forest hid anyone who wanted to harm you made me realize how fragile safety can be when you are truly alone. Even after I left the forest and returned home, I could not relax. I tried to convince myself that the whole situation was just a strange but harmless experience. I kept repeating that no one touched me, no one attacked me, nothing actually happened besides strange footprints, strange silence, and the sense of being watched. But deep down I knew that this comfort was fake. Something about that place was wrong. Something had been out there in the dark, walking around barefoot, large and heavy, and it had come so close to me without making a sound. That was the detail that bothered me the most. Even when I heard footsteps from far away, when the footsteps reached my tent, I never heard the ground shift or leaves move near me. It was as if the person or whatever it was had complete control over every movement. Someone heavy should have made noise right next to me, but I heard nothing but that slow exhale. That part kept replaying in my head over and over. After I got home, I unpacked my gear slowly. Every item reminded me of something in the forest. The smell of pine from my sleeping bag, the dirt stuck in the soles of my hiking boots, even the leftover camping fuel. Everything felt like it was still connected to that silent forest. I cleaned the tent outside in the yard and shook dust out of it. As I did, something small fell from the fabric onto the ground. It was a tiny piece of stone, a flake from the same type of rock that had been stacked near my camp. My stomach tightened again. I stared at the small jagged piece on the concrete. Maybe it had stuck to the fabric when the wind knocked one of the stones loose. Maybe it was nothing, but the idea that the stone had come from something placed near me while I was gone or while I slept made my skin crawl. That night, even in my home, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the forest again. Dark, silent, with trees closing in overhead and something standing just beyond the reach of the light. I kept remembering the footprints near my car. If someone could follow me that deep inside the woods, watch my camp, and then approach my vehicle without being seen, then they had been tracking me long before I realized it. That meant I was never alone, not even on that first peaceful afternoon. I started thinking backward. The sounds that first night might not have been something passing through. They could have been someone approaching and stepping back because I woke up. The footprint in the morning might not have been the only one, just the one I happened to notice. The silence of the forest might not have been natural at all. Maybe the animals that normally created noise were gone because something else had taken over that space, something they knew to avoid. For the next few days, I continued my life with this heavy feeling inside me. I went to work. I ate meals. I walked around my house, but everything felt slightly off. I found myself checking the windows at night before turning off the lights. I kept the curtains drawn more often. When I walked outside to take the trash out, I looked at the edge of the yard to make sure no one was there. I told myself I was being irrational. The forest was hours away. There was no possible way that whoever was out there was following me home. It was just the leftover stress of being alone in a threatening environment for too long. 3 days after returning, the fear finally started to fade. I slept better that night. I woke up feeling almost normal. That morning, I decided to reset my mind with something calm. I took a walk around a nearby local park. There were families, cyclists, dogs, joggers, everyday life. The noise of people talking, children laughing, and cars moving on the road reminded me that the world was normal. The silence in the forest had been unnatural, but it had stayed there. I told myself again that what happened was just a strange encounter with someone who probably lived out there or wandered far into the woods. Then something happened that brought that same fear right back up. When I finished my walk and returned to my car in the public parking lot of the park, I noticed dirt on the back bumper. It was smeared, as if someone with bare feet had stepped on the bumper or used it to boost themselves up. I stared at it without moving. The dirt was fresh and thick, not city dust. It was forest dirt, dark brown with pine needle particles. I felt my throat tighten. My eyes scanned the parking lot. There were people walking, some kids riding bikes, an old couple feeding pigeons. No one looked suspicious. No one looked like they had been crawling around cars. But the dirt was still there. I leaned down to inspect it more closely. A faint imprint of toes was visible in the smudge. Bare toes, large like the prints in the forest. A heavy cold feeling spread through my body. I wiped the dirt away with a tissue and stood there breathing slowly. Someone had touched my vehicle again. Either they followed me here, or the dirt had been smeared earlier and I had not noticed it until now. I tried to calm myself with logic. Maybe I parked too close to a flower bed and dirt got stuck on the bumper when I backed out. But deep down I knew the difference between random dust and a smear from something heavy pressing against the car. I looked around the parking lot again. People came and left, but everything looked so normal that it made the situation feel even stranger. Fear hit harder when everything around you looked peaceful. I got into the car and sat there without starting the engine. My mind went into overdrive. If someone really followed me from the forest, how would they do it? They could have followed me down the forest road, maybe walking along the trees while I drove, then followed the main highway on foot. That sounded impossible. No one could cover that distance in that short time. They would have needed a vehicle. But if they had a vehicle, then why walk barefoot everywhere? None of it made sense. The only thing that made sense was that someone with unusual behavior was watching me in the woods, somehow got close to my car before I arrived, and then returned deeper into the forest. That scenario explained the footprints near my car the first day, but it did not explain the dirt appearing 3 days later in a town parking lot hundreds of miles away. The more I tried to rationalize it, the more impossible it became. I drove home slowly, checking the rearview mirror often. Nothing followed me, no strange cars, no lone pedestrians staring. I parked in my driveway and walked around the car to inspect it again. I found nothing new. The smear I cleaned earlier was the only sign. Even so, I could not shake the feeling that something from the forest was still connected to me. My home suddenly felt smaller. The walls did not feel as safe as I expected. I checked the locks twice before sitting down in the living room. That night, sleep became difficult again. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The silence of my house felt different from the silence of the forest. The forest was emptiness and heavy pressure, like everything was waiting. The house was quiet but with distant sounds outside, the hum of appliances, the sigh of the building settling. Normal sounds, but my mind kept replaying the last night in the tent. The slow footsteps, the breathing, the way it just stood outside the thin fabric that separated us. I kept thinking about how thin the tent walls were. If that thing had wanted to, it could have reached in and pulled me out. Nothing stopped it except its own decision. That meant it chose not to, and I did not know why. The next morning, I walked outside into the yard to get some fresh air. It was cool and bright. The sun warmed the grass. While walking along the fence line, I noticed something near the corner post. 3 small stones stacked on top of each other in a straight line. My chest tightened. I stared at them, unmoving. I had not placed them there. No one else had come into the yard. I lived alone. The gate was locked from the inside. The stones looked like the same type from the forest, flat, gray, and rough. I backed away slowly. My breathing changed. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I looked around the yard. The trees along the street swayed in the wind. Birds moved in the branches. Cars passed in the distance. Everything looked normal. But right there in my own yard was the same silent sign that had been in the woods. Someone had entered my property. They had come close, placed their strange symbol, and left without being seen. That was the moment I understood something that pushed me from fear into something darker. Whatever had been in the forest did not stay there. It followed me. It knew where I lived. It was not an accident. It was not coincidence. It was deliberate. I took the stones and locked them inside the garage. I did not throw them away because I felt like doing that might provoke something. I spent the rest of the day on edge, standing near windows, listening for sounds outside, looking for movement in the yard. But nothing happened. No footprints, no shadows, no strange noises. And that silence was worse because it meant the next move would be unpredictable. That night I hardly slept. Every sound in the house made me tense. I left a light on in the hall. I stayed awake listening for footsteps outside the windows. At around 2 in the morning, I finally drifted into a shallow sleep. I woke again when I heard something lightly tapping. I sat up slowly. The tapping repeated. It was not mechanical. It was not random. It sounded like something knocking lightly against the surface. I followed the noise with my ears. It was coming from outside my bedroom wall, near the window. Something or someone was tapping on the siding of the house. Slowly, not hard, just enough to make noise. The tapping stopped. Silence again. I sat frozen. I did not move. I listened for a full minute. Then I reached slowly for the phone to call someone, but the tapping started again. 2 taps, 3 taps, then silence. I did not go outside. I did not approach the window. I stayed inside, listening. The tapping continued in irregular intervals for almost 10 minutes, as if something was moving slowly around the side of the house and tapping at different places. Then it stopped completely. The rest of the night was silent. I did not sleep again. When the sun rose, I went outside carefully. I walked the perimeter of the house. I found no footprints, no broken branches, no disturbed dirt. But when I reached the far side near the window, I saw a new set of stones on the ground. 3 stones stacked just like the others. This time they were placed directly against the foundation wall. My entire body felt weak. This was no imagination, no leftover fear, no trick of memory. Someone had been outside my house tapping on the wall in the middle of the night and had left another sign. Whoever it was had been close enough to touch the house. Close enough to look in windows if they wanted. Close enough that only a thin sheet of glass separated us. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? That someone from the woods had followed me home without leaving footprints and stacked stones around my house at night? They would think I was paranoid or sleep-deprived. And even if they came, whoever was doing this moved silently and left almost no evidence. I went back inside and closed every curtain. I sat in the living room thinking about what I could do. Leaving the house would not solve anything. If someone could track me from the forest to a public park and then to my home, they could find me anywhere. I realized that the problem was no longer location. It was attention. Something in the woods had noticed me, watched me, and decided to follow me. I did not understand why. I tried to remember everything I did out there. Did I disturb something? Take something I should not have? Did I walk somewhere I wasn't supposed to? There was nothing obvious. I went to the garage and looked at the 3 stones I had collected earlier. They sat in a small pile on the workbench. Something told me not to touch them again. I closed the door and locked it. I stayed inside the rest of the day. When night came, the fear became physical again. I could feel it in my chest and in my hands. My house was quiet, but instead of comfort, it brought anxiety. Every small creak made me focus. Every shadow looked deeper than usual. I sat in the dark living room with a flashlight on the table and waited. Hours passed without anything happening. I began to think maybe nothing would occur. Maybe the stones were a final message. Maybe whatever followed me had finished whatever it wanted to do. I finally fell asleep on the couch near sunrise. When I woke up, my body was stiff and my head hurt. I rubbed my eyes and sat up slowly. Rays of morning light came through the blinds. For a moment, I felt peaceful. Then I stood and walked toward the front door to get the morning air. When I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, I froze. There were footprints in the thin morning dew on the concrete. Large, bare footprints, leading from the yard to the front steps, then stopping just a few feet from the door. They were fresh. They had appeared sometime between when I fell asleep and when I woke up. Whoever made them had stood at my front door in the middle of the night while I slept only a few feet away behind a locked door. Something was escalating. I had planned the trip for months, checking maps, looking at satellite images, and reading every online report about the area I was heading to. The idea was simple: a weekend alone in the backcountry. No people, no distractions, just me, my gear, and the forest. I wanted the quiet, the isolation, the kind of emptiness that makes you feel alive and small at the same time. I told myself I was prepared. I had the backpack, the stove, the tent, extra water, food, first aid kit, compass, and even a small satellite tracker. I had trained for long hikes, I knew how to read a map, and I had some experience camping in the wilderness, but nothing really prepares you for what it feels like to be completely alone in the woods when things start to go wrong. The first day of the hike was easy. The trail was quiet but well-marked, the sun warm on my shoulders, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. Birds were singing, and every now and then a squirrel would scamper across the path. I kept my pace slow, enjoying the way the forest seemed to stretch endlessly around me. After a few hours, I found a small clearing near a creek. The water was clear and fast, running over rocks and making a steady, soothing sound. I decided this would be my first camp. I set up the tent, collected firewood, and made a small fire. The smoke rose in thin streams, and the crackle of the fire was comforting, almost hypnotic. I cooked a simple meal, a mix of rice, beans, and canned vegetables, and sat there watching the shadows of the trees grow long as the sun sank lower. The night was peaceful at first. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the creek, the wind through the trees, and the distant call of some unknown animal. I felt a strange kind of comfort in knowing I was alone, but that comfort started to fade after a few hours. Around midnight, I heard a sound I couldn't place. At first I thought it was the wind, but it was too deliberate. A low, dragging noise, like something heavy moving across the forest floor. My heart started to beat faster. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around the clearing, but everything looked normal. No movement, no shapes, just the dark forest and the firelight dancing on the edges of the trees. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, something natural, but the sound didn't stop. It circled the clearing, slow, deliberate, close enough that I could hear twigs snapping under whatever it was. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, watching the fire, waiting for the sound to end. Eventually, it moved away, fading into the night. I don't think I slept much after that. Morning came, and I told myself that the night had been nothing but a trick of the dark. I packed up quickly, feeling the tension in my shoulders. I decided to move deeper into the backcountry, where fewer people went. My goal was a small ridge I had spotted on the satellite images, which promised a view of the surrounding forest and a quiet spot to camp the second night. The hike was harder than I expected. The terrain became steeper, the trail less defined, and I had to climb over fallen logs and through dense underbrush. Sweat ran down my back, and my legs burned. I took frequent breaks, drinking water and eating small snacks. I kept my eyes open for any sign of animals or other hikers, but I saw nothing. The forest was silent in a different way than the night before, more empty, heavier somehow. Around late afternoon, I reached the ridge. The view was breathtaking. The forest stretched in every direction, a sea of green interrupted by occasional streams glinting in the sun. I found a flat spot for my tent, collected wood, and started a fire. This time, I took extra care, surrounding it with rocks and making a larger circle to keep it controlled. I ate, drank, and tried to relax, but something about the place felt off. The trees were taller, older, and the shadows between them seemed deeper. I couldn't explain it, but my body kept tensing, reacting to some instinct I couldn't ignore. The second night was worse than the first. About an hour after dark, I heard the dragging sound again, closer this time. It moved in a circle around my camp, slow, deliberate, and quiet except for the occasional crack of a branch. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but the shadows between the trees looked wrong, alive somehow. I kept the fire going, adding wood constantly. I thought about leaving, hiking back down in the dark, but I didn't know the terrain well enough to feel safe doing that. My phone had no signal, and the satellite tracker was useless without a clear sky. I lay awake for hours, heart pounding, waiting for the sound to leave. At some point it stopped, or maybe I just stopped hearing it, but sleep was impossible. The next morning I made a plan. I would pack up and hike out as fast as possible, staying alert the whole way. I checked my gear, made sure I had enough food and water, and set off down the ridge. The descent was tricky. Loose rocks and steep slopes slowed me down, and I had to keep my hands on trees and roots for balance. Every shadow made me jump. Every sound, birds calling, wind in the trees, made me tense. And then I heard it again, behind me, slow and dragging. I didn't dare look. I increased my pace, trying to stay calm, reminding myself it was probably a wild animal, maybe a bear or a large dog. But it stayed behind me, following me for what felt like hours. By midday, I reached a small creek crossing, where I could hear the water rushing over rocks. I paused to drink and rest. That's when I noticed the tracks. Large, deep impressions in the mud, dragging marks between them. My stomach sank. They weren't from a deer or any normal animal. They were heavy, human-sized, and the drag marks looked like something was being carried, or someone was deliberately moving slowly, making noise without stepping lightly. I felt a cold sweat on my back. I didn't know if it was hunters, poachers, or something else, but I knew I had to stay ahead. I didn't have a weapon, only a small pocket knife, and I was miles from the nearest road. Panic set in, but I forced myself to think clearly. I moved faster, jumping over fallen logs, slipping in mud, and sometimes crawling under branches. The tracks stayed behind me, keeping pace. I couldn't tell how far back the person or animal was, but I could feel them following. I tried to make noise, stomped on branches, shouted randomly, hoping to scare it away or at least make it obvious I was alert. But there was no response. Silence. And then a snap from deeper in the woods. I froze, heart pounding, and waited. Nothing came. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself the safest thing was to stay on the trail and reach the road. Hours passed. My legs burned, my backpack weighed me down, and the sun began to dip low. I finally saw a faint line of smoke in the distance, a sign of a small town or campsite. Relief surged, but the tracks were still behind me. I considered climbing a tree to hide, but I knew it would only slow me down. I had to reach safety. As night fell, I stumbled onto an old service road. My legs were shaking, my mouth dry, but I kept moving. The dragging sound had stopped, or maybe it had just faded into the distance. I didn't look back. Eventually, I saw headlights approaching from the distance. I waved frantically, and the car stopped. The driver, a man on his way back from a late shift, looked at me, confused and worried. I jumped into the car, shaking, and gave him my location. Within minutes, he had called the local authorities. They escorted me back to town, checked the area where I had camped, and confirmed the tracks. They said it was likely an illegal hunting operation, moving equipment and game through the forest at night, which explained the dragging and deliberate sounds. I finally felt safe. The authorities advised me not to go back to that area alone, and I realized how lucky I had been. I was shaken for days afterward, unable to shake the feeling of being followed. I had prepared for every danger I could imagine in the wilderness. Bears, storms, injuries, but I hadn't prepared for people. I had underestimated the risk of encountering someone else with ill intent. The experience changed the way I approached camping forever. I now always check for human activity, avoid isolated trails if possible, carry stronger communication equipment, and stay alert to the smallest details of my surroundings. The fear I felt that night was real, primal, and it stayed with me, but so did the lesson. The wilderness is unpredictable, not just because of nature, but because of people. And even though I had wanted a peaceful escape, a moment of solitude in the forest, I realized that real danger doesn't come from the shadows or the wind. It comes from those who walk the same earth with hidden motives. I survived, and I got home safely, but the memory of those dragging steps behind me, circling my camp, and following me down the ridge will never leave. I had planned this camping trip for months. The idea was simple: escape the city for a few days, go deep into the forest, and disconnect from everything. I packed carefully, taking only what I thought I would need: a tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, water, food, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I had been camping before, but only in well-traveled areas. This time, I wanted something more isolated, something quiet where I could feel completely alone in the woods. The drive took longer than I expected. As I left the paved road behind, the narrow dirt track twisted through the forest. Pine trees towered on either side, and the late afternoon sun filtered through the branches, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and move as I drove. I noticed how quiet it was. The usual hum of cars, trucks, or people was gone, replaced by the occasional rustle of birds or the wind in the trees. I felt a mixture of excitement and unease, the kind that comes when you leave the safety of civilization behind. Eventually, I reached a small clearing that I had seen on the map. The ground was uneven, covered in dry leaves, roots, and fallen branches. I parked my car, stepped out, and let the forest sounds wash over me. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the lines were tight and the ground stakes secure. The air was cooler here than I had expected. Even in the late afternoon, the forest floor held a damp chill. I collected some dry branches for a small fire later, careful not to disturb the natural surroundings too much. Once the tent was ready, I walked further into the forest to explore. The trees were dense, the ground soft with pine needles. Every step seemed louder than the last. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how the forest changed. The air grew damper, shadows darker, and the sounds sharper. Birds chirped less frequently, replaced by the occasional snap of a twig somewhere out of sight. My senses were on high alert, the way they always are when you're alone in the wilderness. I told myself it was all normal, that the forest was alive and full of noises. I returned to the campsite before sunset and started a small fire. Flames flickered against the surrounding trees, casting long shadows. I cooked a simple meal of beans and bread, the smell of smoke mixing with the scent of pine and damp earth. I sat back and watched the sun sink behind the horizon, the light fading until everything was shades of gray and black. Once the fire had burned down to embers, I retreated into my tent. The forest outside was dark now, almost impossibly so. I zipped the tent shut, relying on the thin layer of nylon to make me feel safe. Sleep did not come easily. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves outside my tent made my heart race. I kept reminding myself I was alone, but not entirely. There were animals, possibly deer or raccoons, maybe even a fox. But then there were noises that didn't sound like animals. A scraping sound, low and deliberate, moving through the brush just beyond the edge of the clearing. I froze, listening. The noise stopped. I told myself it must have been the wind or my imagination. Morning came too quickly. I unzipped the tent to see a thin layer of fog clinging to the forest floor. The air was damp, my clothes slightly wet from the humidity. I ate a small breakfast and decided to hike further in, following a narrow path I had seen while exploring the day before. The trail was rough and unmarked in most places, covered in roots and fallen leaves. I marked my way with small stacks of stones so I could find the path back to the campsite. Hours passed as I moved deeper into the forest. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, mostly deer, but a few looked different, larger, more deliberate, almost like they belonged to a human. I shook off the thought quickly. There had to be hikers in the area. I reminded myself I was careful, carrying a small knife and making sure I had a working flashlight. The forest was silent in a way that made every small sound feel enormous. A branch snapping nearby made me jump. I decided to turn back to the campsite before it got too late. The path seemed longer than I remembered, the forest more oppressive. Shadows clung to the trees even though the sun was still high. I began to feel disoriented. Familiar landmarks I had passed earlier seemed different now. A large rock that had been on the right of the trail was now on the left, or maybe I had missed it before. Panic started to creep in. I stopped, trying to calm myself, breathing slowly and listening. There was nothing. Then I heard it again, the low scraping sound, like someone dragging a heavy object through the brush. This time it was closer. My first instinct was to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. I gripped my knife tightly and kept moving along the trail, trying not to make noise. The scraping continued, sometimes faster, sometimes stopping as if whoever or whatever was out there was also watching me. My heart pounded in my chest, each step feeling like it could give me away. By late afternoon, I finally saw the clearing where I had left my tent. Relief washed over me, but as I approached, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The stacks of stones I had used to mark my trail back were disturbed, scattered across the path. Footprints led toward the tent. Someone had been there while I was gone. My first thought was to run to my car, but it was parked some distance away, and I had no idea where this person was. I approached the tent cautiously, knife in hand. The tent flap was slightly open, not fully zipped. My belongings were untouched, which surprised me, but I could feel that I was not alone. The forest around the clearing seemed darker, heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I realized I had underestimated the danger. I had thought of animals maybe getting lost, but I had not thought about another person being in the forest with me, someone who might not be friendly. I spent the next hour quietly packing everything. I avoided making any noise, listening for the scraping sound that seemed to move with the wind. Finally, I was ready to leave. I kept my knife ready and flashlight on. The hike back to the car felt longer than the hike in, every shadow and sound amplified. A branch cracked behind me, and I turned sharply, shining the flashlight. There was nothing, just a deer darting into the trees. But I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. When I reached the car, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. I locked the doors and sat inside for a moment, catching my breath. The forest loomed around me, silent now, almost peaceful again, but I knew it could change in an instant. I drove slowly back to the main road, checking the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see a figure following me among the trees. By the time I reached the paved road, sunlight was fading. I finally relaxed a little, realizing that I had gotten through it. The experience left me shaken, but I also felt a sense of accomplishment. I had faced something in the wilderness that had made me afraid in a very real way and survived. I knew I would never forget the feeling of being alone in that forest, hearing the scraping sound, not knowing what was out there. I drove home, exhausted, and as I pulled into my driveway, I realized how much I had underestimated the importance of preparation, awareness, and respect for the wilderness, and for the possibility that other people, not just animals or the environment, can pose real danger. I unloaded my gear, setting it carefully in the garage, and promised myself I would never take isolation for granted again. That trip had been terrifying, but it had also taught me something crucial. Survival depends on caution, observation, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. From that day forward, I never went into a forest alone without leaving a clear plan, checking my equipment twice, and making sure someone knew exactly where I was going. The forest itself was beautiful, serene, and full of life, but I had learned firsthand that beauty can hide danger, and the quietest places can be the most frightening. I never forgot the feeling of that low, scraping sound behind me, the unknown presence in the trees, and the racing heartbeat that carried me back to safety. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from everything, from the city, from work, from people. I didn't want a crowded campsite with loud families or tourists. I wanted isolation, a place where the only sounds were the wind, the trees, and my own breathing. I spent weeks researching remote areas, checking topographic maps, reading hiking reports, making sure I had everything I might need for 3 nights alone in the wilderness. I packed carefully. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag rated for cold nights, extra clothes, enough food for a week just in case, a first aid kit, a small portable stove, a reliable water filter, a headlamp with extra batteries, and a compass and map. I left my phone in the car after making sure it had full signal on the road, knowing that once I was in the woods, I'd be cut off from everyone. The day I left, I drove for hours through winding roads, climbing into the mountains, until the pavement ended and I was on gravel and dirt paths barely wide enough for a single vehicle. I parked at a small pull-off and checked the map one last time. The trail I wanted started here. I should be able to reach a flat clearing near a stream by nightfall if I moved steadily. The forest looked dense, but the sun was still high, and I felt a rush of excitement as I hoisted my backpack and stepped onto the trail. The first few hours were easy. The path was narrow and rough, but I had a good rhythm. Birds sang in the treetops, and I passed patches of wildflowers and small clearings where sunlight spilled onto the forest floor. I noticed signs of wildlife, scratches on tree bark from deer or bears, broken branches that showed animals had passed recently, but nothing alarming. I kept my knife strapped to my belt and made a mental note of where I was at every turn. The terrain got steeper as I climbed, the air cooler and the forest quieter. I stopped once or twice to drink water and eat a small snack. By the time the sun began to dip, I was still a couple of miles from my intended campsite, but I could see a small clearing ahead along the edge of the stream. Perfect. I set up my tent quickly. I cleared the ground of twigs and stones, dug a shallow trench around it to divert any rainwater, and used extra stakes to secure it against the wind. I collected a stack of dry wood and kindling nearby and set it in a neat pile. I filled my water bottle from the stream and filtered it carefully, then set up my stove and cooked a simple meal of rice and canned beans. The smell of cooking filled the air, mixing with the scent of wet earth and pine. I felt satisfied, alone, tired, but completely in control. I ate slowly, enjoying every bite, then washed my cooking pot in the stream and brushed my teeth with the filtered water. Night fell fast in the mountains. The sky turned a deep purple, stars began to appear, and the temperature dropped sharply. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it tightly around me, and lay listening to the forest. There was the rustle of leaves, the distant sound of running water, maybe a branch breaking somewhere far off. I felt a chill run down my spine, not from fear but from the sheer intensity of being alone in such a vast, wild place. I thought about my route for the next day and drifted off to sleep, the sound of the stream lulling me. I woke abruptly around midnight. Something felt wrong. My tent flap had been moving slightly in the wind, or maybe it wasn't the wind. I strained my ears. There was a soft crunch of leaves just outside. My heart rate picked up. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon looking for food. I stayed very still, trying to listen without making any noise. The sound stopped after a few tense minutes, and I tried to calm myself, telling myself everything was fine. Eventually, I fell back asleep, though I slept lightly, half aware of every noise. At around 2 a.m., I woke again, this time to a louder noise. Someone or something was moving through the clearing. Heavy steps, not light like a deer. The kind of sound that makes your stomach tighten and your muscles lock. I stayed inside my sleeping bag, thinking, rationally, that it might be another camper lost in the dark. But the area was supposed to be deserted, and the nearest road was miles away. My first instinct was to ignore it and stay put, but part of me wanted to see who or what was there. I slowly unzipped the tent and peeked out. Moonlight illuminated part of the clearing. Nothing was immediately visible, but then I saw it. Footprints, fresh in the soft soil, leading from the tree line toward my tent. Large, heavy footprints. Not human. My stomach dropped. I remembered the bear warning signs near the trailhead. This part of the forest had black bears, sometimes even grizzlies in higher elevations. I had packed bear spray, but it was in my backpack a few feet away, and moving outside meant exposing myself. I froze. The sound came again. A low, heavy rustling as something moved in the brush near the stream. I could see the branches bending unnaturally. My mind raced. I grabbed my headlamp quietly, flicked it on, and aimed it toward the noise. A pair of glowing eyes reflected in the beam, and I felt an instant jolt of fear. A large bear was standing maybe 20 feet from my tent, sniffing the air. I froze for a moment, heart hammering. Then I remembered everything I had read about bear encounters. Do not run, make yourself look big, slowly back away, speak in a calm, firm voice if possible, use deterrence if necessary. I stayed inside my tent and turned on the flashlight, making as much noise as I dared without stepping out. The bear moved closer, drawn by the smell of my food. I cursed silently, realizing I hadn't hung my extra food in a tree as recommended. Panic pressed on my chest. I grabbed the bear spray and unstrapped it, keeping my eyes on the animal through the mesh of the tent. It sniffed around, then swiped at the pile of firewood with a paw. A log rolled, clattering to the ground. The bear flinched but did not retreat. My hands shook. I had to act. I remembered that loud noises can scare bears away. I grabbed a heavy rock and threw it toward a tree, not at the bear, and screamed as loudly as I could, hoping to startle it. The bear hesitated, then bolted back into the trees. I stayed frozen for a long time, listening. Eventually, the sounds faded. I knew I couldn't stay there, not after that. My first thought was to pack up quietly and move, but the forest was dark, and the moon had disappeared behind clouds. I didn't have a flashlight strong enough to navigate safely through thick brush in the middle of the night. I considered hiking back to my car, but that was at least a 2-hour trek in the dark over steep terrain. Every sound of cracking twigs made my stomach tighten. I decided the safest option was to stay awake and wait for first light. I packed the remaining food securely in my bag and set it away from the tent, zipped everything closed, and lay in my sleeping bag trying to stay alert. Every little sound made me flinch. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant roar of a stream that suddenly sounded louder in the night. I did not sleep again. By dawn, I was exhausted but alive. I carefully unzipped the tent and looked around. Nothing. No tracks, no bear. I decided I couldn't stay. I packed everything, double-checked my map, and began the hike back to my car. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less threatening, but I kept a constant eye on my surroundings. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump, but I moved steadily. By late morning, I reached the pull-off where I had parked. My car had been untouched. I drove away slowly, keeping a watchful eye on the trees lining the road, adrenaline still running through my veins. I had survived. I had made mistakes. I had not hung my food. I had underestimated the wildlife. But I had learned a lesson about respect for nature, preparation, and caution. I drove home in silence, exhausted, grateful to be safe, and I never camped alone in such remote wilderness again. I decided to go camping alone deep inside a national forest at the beginning of autumn. I had been stressed from work and wanted a quiet few days away from everything. I wanted peace, silence, and fresh air. I packed everything myself, including my small tent, a sleeping bag, a heavy backpack with canned food, a small portable stove, a first aid kit, extra socks, a flashlight, and a map of the forest. I also carried a fixed blade knife, not for anything dramatic but just for basic safety and cutting branches or rope if needed. I knew the forest well enough from pictures and satellite view, but I had never actually been there in person. I liked the idea of being alone in the wilderness with no cell signal, no noise, and nobody around. The drive took hours. I parked my car near a small dirt road that was barely used. Once I stepped out, the air felt clean and cold in a nice way. Leaves were partly changing color, and everything looked calm. I put on my backpack, locked the car, and started walking on a narrow path that had no signs or directions. The sound of the forest was relaxing. Small twigs breaking under my shoes, wind moving through the trees, and birds calling in a slow, peaceful rhythm. I didn't have any anxiety or fear. I felt confident, relaxed, and happy to be on this small adventure. After an hour of walking, I reached a place where the trees opened slightly and sunlight slipped through more easily. It seemed like the perfect camping spot. The ground was mostly flat with dry leaves scattered everywhere. I dropped my backpack and took in the area. No trash, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been here for a long time. It felt untouched, like I was the first person to walk there in years. I quickly set up my tent, tightened the ropes, and checked everything to make sure it was stable. I then collected some dry sticks from the ground and set up a small fire pit. I didn't plan to make a big fire every night, but I wanted the comfort of flames and warmth. As the sun lowered, the forest got quieter, and the cold came in slowly. I heated a small can of beans and ate sitting on a fallen log. The fire crackled softly, and the sky turned darker and darker until the stars began to show. I had no thoughts in my mind except how peaceful everything felt. When the temperature dropped further, I got into my tent, zipped it shut, and crawled into my sleeping bag. I drifted off gradually as the forest sounds faded into the background like a natural lullaby. I woke up sometime in the night, not from a noise but from a strange heavy sense that something was different. It felt like the air pressure had changed. I couldn't explain it. There were no voices, no footsteps, nothing obvious, but for some reason I felt fully awake all of a sudden. I looked at my watch in the dim light. It was almost 3 a.m. I slowly unzipped the sleeping bag and listened. The forest was dead silent. No wind, no bugs, nothing. The silence itself felt unnatural. I lay still, waiting for any sound, even a small one, but there was nothing. I eventually closed my eyes again and forced myself to relax until sleep returned. The next morning I woke up late, around 9 a.m., feeling rested but with a faint memory of how strange the night felt. I stepped out of the tent and stretched. The air smelled fresh and cold. I gathered wood for a morning fire and boiled water for instant oatmeal. That was when I noticed something that made me pause. About 10 meters from my tent, the leaf litter on the ground looked disturbed. It wasn't from an animal digging or from me walking. It looked like someone had stepped there repeatedly, pacing back and forth in a short line. The marks were too straight and consistent to be animal tracks. They looked like a person had been standing there quietly at night, moving slightly or shifting weight from one foot to another. I stood still, staring at the ground. The first thought that came to my mind was that maybe I had stepped there myself the day before without noticing, but I knew I hadn't walked in that particular spot. The idea made my stomach feel slightly cold. Someone might have been standing outside while I slept. I checked the tree line, moving slowly and scanning everything. No movement, no sound, nothing suspicious. I tried to push the idea away and told myself I was overthinking. Maybe it was an animal I didn't recognize. I forced myself to continue with my morning routine, though the feeling stayed in the back of my head like a small weight pressing down. I decided to explore deeper into the woods that day. I packed some water, my knife, a granola bar, and a small notepad to mark directions and distances. I didn't want to get lost, especially because there were no signs or marked trails. I walked north from my campsite, noticing how thick the trees became. The deeper I went, the darker it felt because the branches blocked the sunlight. The ground was soft with layers of old leaves that had been piling up for years. Every step made a dull, hushed crunch. After about 20 minutes of walking, I heard a sound behind me like something stepping on dry sticks. I stopped and listened carefully. The forest went silent again. I looked back but saw nothing. I continued walking, and a few minutes later, I heard the same type of noise again. A slow, calculated step. Not running, not animal movement. Slow and spaced out. I kept turning around to check, but I couldn't see anything because the trees were too dense. The branches blocked long lines of sight, and anyone could have been standing 10 meters away without being visible. I kept moving and reached a rocky clearing near a shallow stream. The sound of running water was comforting and helped me relax a bit. I stayed there drinking some water and thinking. I told myself that animals move strangely sometimes and that I shouldn't panic. But there was still that uneasy pressure in the back of my mind, the same one from the night before. I checked the time and realized it was already afternoon, so I headed back toward camp. I moved more carefully now, trying to watch behind me every few steps. I couldn't shake the idea that I was not alone. When I reached the campsite, everything was exactly as I left it. My tent stood untouched, the fire pit was cold, and my backpack rested where I placed it. That should have been reassuring, but the lack of disturbance almost made it more uncomfortable. If someone was watching me out there in the forest, they were careful, patient, and silent. That was worse than the idea of someone just passing by randomly. I spent the rest of the evening preparing a fire and trying to relax. Darkness rolled in quickly, and the forest once again grew cold and extremely quiet. I ate dinner and sat close to the flames. With nothing else to do, I decided to collect more firewood so I would have a supply for the night. I walked a few meters into the trees picking up broken branches. When I came back, I froze. There were fresh footprints in the dirt directly beside my tent. Not mine, not old, fresh, deep. The ground had been slightly soft, and the prints were clear. Someone had been there in the short time I stepped away to gather wood. I looked around in every direction. Nothing, no sound, no movement, just the forest staring back at me. My heartbeat increased out of instinct, and I felt adrenaline flooding my muscles. There was no reason for anyone to be miles deep in the woods with me, especially silently sneaking around my tent when I wasn't looking. I wanted to pack everything and leave, but I also knew hiking back through a dark forest full of unknown danger would be even worse. I forced myself to stay calm. I sat near the fire with my knife close and watched the area. The thought of someone standing between the trees watching me made the skin on the back of my neck feel tight. I sat awake for hours. Eventually, I crawled into the tent, zipped it silently, and lay down without fully sleeping. I kept waking up constantly, listening for the smallest sounds. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I stayed awake the rest of the night, lying in the tent and staring at the thin fabric that separated me from the forest. Every shadow outside seemed heavier than normal. Every rustle of leaves or broken twig made me tense. I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to calm down, but my muscles were tight, ready to spring at the slightest hint of danger. I kept telling myself that the person or animal outside probably wasn't dangerous, but the sound of the steps had left a mark in my mind, a memory of weight and intent I couldn't shake. Morning came eventually. The sky was still gray, but light crept through the thin tent walls. I crawled out slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally quiet. I examined the ground near my tent and food bag. There were faint marks, not entirely clear, but it looked like something or someone had been very close to the tent last night. The impressions faded as they moved away from the clearing. They weren't deep, but they were deliberate, heavy, and measured, not random like an animal wandering through. My stomach turned at the thought that someone had been that close, possibly watching me while I slept. I spent the morning packing carefully. I had no intention of staying another night here. I decided to leave before nightfall. My plan was to hike back to the trailhead as quickly as possible. I didn't rush recklessly because I knew slipping or falling in the dense forest could make things worse. I moved deliberately, examining every root and rock. The forest seemed alive in a different way now, Every sound felt sharper. Every shadow seemed to hold something. I kept my backpack tightly strapped, my water bottle within reach, and my small pocket knife in my hand. It was a precaution, though I didn't fool myself into thinking it would be enough if someone had harmful intent. As I hiked, I noticed things I hadn't seen before. Broken branches at odd angles, footprints that weren't animal, shallow marks in soft dirt that might have been from shoes. They were not on the main trail, but they were near it. Every now and then, I would hear a distant snap or a rustle of leaves, like someone moving slowly and deliberately. I forced myself to keep moving. I didn't look back, I didn't pause, and I didn't stop to investigate. Every time I felt a shadow brush my peripheral vision, I reminded myself that the forest played tricks on the eyes. Still, I kept my pace steady and my mind alert. By late morning, I reached a small stream. The sound of flowing water was comforting. I knelt, drank carefully, and refilled my water bottle. I scanned the surrounding area while drinking. Nothing moved. No shadows, no rustling leaves. The silence was almost soothing after the tension of the night. I stayed for a few minutes, listening to the water, letting the sound remind me that the world was natural, that there were no hidden threats immediately present. But I also kept my knife ready, knowing that even a moment of distraction could be dangerous if someone truly was following me. The rest of the hike back to the trailhead passed slowly. I moved cautiously, listening to every sound. Occasionally, I heard twigs snap behind me, but when I stopped to look, nothing was there. I was almost certain I was being followed. My chest ached with tension. My legs were sore from hiking with a heavy pack, my shoulders stiff from keeping it strapped so tightly. But I could not allow myself to stop. I would not let fear immobilize me. I forced my mind to focus on navigation, to count steps, check landmarks, and mentally mark distances. Around mid-afternoon, I emerged from the dense forest onto a small dirt road that led to the trailhead. Relief washed over me like cold water. I looked back at the forest edge, and for a moment, the strange unease returned. Shadows among the trees seemed too uniform, too quiet. I quickened my pace toward the trailhead parking area. My car was there exactly where I left it. No signs of anyone else, no marks on the ground, no footprints in the dirt around it. I let myself exhale for the first time in almost 24 hours. I unlocked the car and climbed inside, still alert. The car felt like a safe cocoon. I started the engine, the noise almost deafening in the surrounding quiet, and backed out slowly. I didn't look back at the forest. I focused on the road ahead, the familiar lines of the path I had driven before. As I drove, I thought about everything that had happened. The footsteps, the faint marks around my camp, the strange tension in the air that night. It didn't make sense. Nothing tangible, nothing definitive, but the feeling of being watched was real, a weight I could not ignore. On the drive back to the nearest town, I reflected on the experience. It was terrifying in a way I hadn't anticipated. I realized how alone you really are in the forest, how exposed, how vulnerable. It was not about ghosts or monsters. It was the reality of being completely unprotected, at the mercy of the natural world and anyone else who might move through it. That thought lingered far longer than the memory of the night itself. I understood that the forest could be peaceful and safe, but it could also be unpredictable and quietly dangerous, and no preparation or skill could remove that fact entirely. When I reached civilization, I felt a strange mix of relief and residual tension. Everything looked familiar, the streets, the shops, the sounds of cars and people, but I was changed. The experience left a mark in my mind, a memory of the forest that was still vivid even after I returned home. I began checking locks more carefully, carrying a small knife when walking alone, and thinking twice about traveling alone in isolated areas. The fear wasn't irrational, it was grounded in experience, in the knowledge that you can never truly know who or what might be observing, moving silently, waiting, while you think you are alone. For the next few days, I could not shake the memory of those deliberate, measured footsteps, the quiet presence at the edge of my camp. It reminded me that the forest has its own rules, that solitude comes with a price, and that being alone means relying completely on your senses and instincts. I never returned to that trail, never camped alone in a remote forest again. I chose other paths, safer and closer to people, because the fear of the unknown outweighed the desire for solitude. I also realized that fear is not always about immediate danger. Sometimes it is about awareness, about understanding that there is a reality beyond your control. That night in the forest taught me respect and caution. I never found out what had approached my camp. There were no signs, no proof, only the memory of its presence. And that was enough to change the way I approached the world, the way I thought about solitude, safety, and the thin line between peace and danger when you are completely alone.